Okay, so now we are back, and I just want you to look at all the hard work that you have already done. And now we're going to put this together. Here we have our pocket front, all quilted and cut and ready to go, and we're going to add the prairie points. So we're going to come over here to the pressing mat. Now we've already made our cute little prairie points, or picots, lots of fun names. Now we're going to try this new favorite sewing notion of yours, the Elmer's washable glue stick. And as I mentioned before, this is a starch-based product, and so this is going to be okay that it's in your project. Now, to place the prairie points, instead of sewing these together in a chain on the sewing machine, we are going to place them using the glue stick. So I just add a little bit of glue stick along the top, and I don't put the, let me move that this way a little. I don't put the prairie points right next to the edge of, because this is going to end up being in the binding, so I always come in a little bit. I'm going to make sure that the raw edge for my prairie point is just either right at or just a thread below the edge of that quilt. I don't want to have the prairie point being above the edge. And now I'm using the prairie point that opens up, so I'm going to just put a little dab of the glue on the inside, and then I'm going to heat set this down. Now this is kind of like we're overstarching our project. And then I'm going to just lay this one, I'm going to put a little dab of glue, and then I'm going to overlap these prairie points 1/4 of an inch. And you could actually lay them any way that you want to, but if these are overlapped 1/4 of an inch and we sew our binding on the edge of the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then that little point, or that V of the prairie point, is going to be looking just right. And so now we're doing our awesome origami prairie point. So I'm going to put a little dab inside each fold, just so those will all be held down. And then I'm going to overlap 1/4 of an inch. We're going to lay these on. I like to heat set probably every 1 or 2 prairie points. I don't want this glue stick to just air dry. I want to heat set it dry, because it does 2 things. It's going to dry the glue, obviously, but then it also kind of crisps up this edge of our fabric. And so it just keeps those raw edges nice and together. So it kind of has a dual purpose. So I like to dry those with a nice hot iron. So the problem is when to stop. You actually can do as many prairie points as you want to and keep on going, but doesn't that add a nice little accent of color along the front of your quilt? I mean, this is technically our pocket, but this also applies if this was the front of your quilt. So one more little prairie point, overlap that 1/4 of an inch, and heat set that down. That look nice? All right, so now we are ready to add our piping. So we've made our piping using our nylon cord. We have used the piping tool to cut a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on the edge of that piping. And so now we're going to add this to the edge of the quilt. We're going to sew this on the sewing machine just using your regular presser foot. You don't want to use your zipper foot. Remember, we used the zipper foot to make our piping because we could butt that foot right up against that cord. But you don't want to use the zipper foot to sew this onto the quilt, because that zipper foot is so narrow it tends to just fall off the edge of your quilt. So I snapped on just the regular presser foot, and we're going to take this over to the sewing machine. Now again, remember when we made our piping, we lengthened the stitch length because we were just making piping. Now we are just attaching the piping to the top of the quilt, and so again, we can have a longer stitch length because this same seam is going to be sewn again when we sew the binding on the quilt. And so I'm keeping this stitch length at a 3.5. The other thing that I want to point out is that when I sew piping to the edge of the quilt, you want to make sure that you have just a sliver of that quilt showing. It's really easy for that piping to sort of slide off of the edge, but we want to make sure we get that full seam allowance. And so really nothing you can measure, but just a little sliver of that quilt is showing. So we're going to bring this under the presser foot, and that stitch length is lengthened. And we're going to tack this to the edge of the quilt, maybe. Let's give it a little bit extra space. There we go. So just following that same stitch, lining this up. Now you are going through a few little extra layers of thickness, and so I go slow, and that's the other reason why you have lengthened your stitch length a little bit, because you are actually going through several layers here. But doesn't this look nice? So following that same stitch line, a little bit sliver of my quilt is showing, and I'm going to sew that piping to the front of our pocket. All right. Cut that and bring it back. All right, so now all these are nice in place. I like to give this just a little bit of a tug, just to make sure that that cording is nice and flat inside here. Now, the other thing that I want to show you is after the piping is sewn onto the front of the quilt, either with your rotary cutter or scissors, we're just going to cut this off at the edge. Now, on some quilts, if we are putting this piping around the edge of the whole quilt, I want to bring this quilt and show you. If you are going to put piping around the whole, on all four sides of your quilt, if you look right here, we are actually overlapping the piping. We're not going to try to turn the corner with one piece of piping. You're going to sew the piping on the edge, you're going to cut it off, and then I'm going to show you a little tip for an easy way to go around that corner. What I like to do is I open up this seam, especially since you cut that off. See, that seam will just open right up. I want to make sure I only have the cording exposed, and I snip off about a 1/2 inch of that cording. And then I close this back up. And so now we have our piping with no cording in it, and we're going to just lay that, right over the top. And so do you see how these two are overlapped? And now again, I'm going to extend the end of this piping when I start the sewing, sew along that same stitch line, and that's the way you're going to go around all four sides of your quilt. Just taking that cording out of that first part, overlapping it, and tacking it on. Okay. All right, so now we have the piping sewn on the front of the quilt. I'm going to snip off this other side. And now it's time to attach the binding. Now, let me move that out of the way just a little bit. Okay, so now when we're adding the binding to the front of the edge of your quilt, when you sew your piping and you trim your piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you should be able to comfortably lay your binding over the top and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and have that turn out perfect every time. But I want to show you a little tip just to take the worry out of that and make this a little bit simpler. We're going to turn the quilt over so the piping, or so the front of the quilt is down, and then we're going to put the binding is still going to go on the front edge of the quilt. Okay, so front of the quilt, you have your binding here, but because we've sewed the piping on, we are going to sew the binding on the quilt, and we're just going to follow the same line that we sewed the piping on with. So this just makes it completely foolproof, very easy, and you're just going to match up these raw edges. Now let's go over to the sewing machine. And now what we're going to do now is we're going to take that stitch length back down to your normal stitch length. And then we're going to place the binding and our quilt with raw edges matching. Okay, so we just want to make sure that those raw edges are together. we're going to follow the same line that you sewed your piping on with. Just right on top of that same line. Get that started. Matching up raw edges. Isn't this a lot faster? So we don't need to worry about that seam. We don't need to worry that we're not going to catch this. And I'll tell you, another little tip is when you are adding piping to the edge of your quilt, if you put a contrasting thread in the bobbin, that would be this thread right here that we are seeing right now. If you put a contrasting thread that you can easily see, that actually makes this part a lot easier. So now we're going to keep sewing all the way down until that's sewn on. Again, we don't need to worry about back tacking. All right, now I'm just going to trim this off. I always give myself just a little bit of extra, just for good measure, a little 1/4 inch extra. All right, so now look how nice that looks. So now your piping is sewn on, your binding is sewn to the front of that. The next step, we're going to come back over to the pressing board. And I like to do this on all my quilts. The first thing I do is I go to the back of the quilt. It's really easy. See how this is all kind of curled up? It's really easy for this to get kind of bunched up. So the first thing I like to do is I just press this flat. I'm pressing the back of that quilt. See how that's nice and flat. And then I'm going to turn the quilt over. And I'm going to do the same thing. What I'm doing is I am just pressing that binding away from the quilt. Now keeping in mind, remember that this is a bias edge, okay? So I don't want to come in here ironing back and forth and press and stretch this out. Pretty much the tip of the iron, I'm coming in and I'm just pushing that binding away from the edge of the quilt. Just like that. All right, see, now that's a lot more flat, really easy to manage. And now we're ready to secure the binding to the back of the quilt. So we're going to use our new favorite sewing notion. And what I would call this would just be a temporary, this is a temporary adhesive that we're using right now. Technically, we're overstarching this. And so let's see, I'm going to start at this side. Let's get everything in the right spot here. Okay, so I'm going to get the glue stick and I'm going to, you want to be careful of raw edges. I like to make sure I have a glue stick that's nice and easy to slide. If it's really thick and sticky, I wouldn't use that one. I usually just go a little bit at a time. And then I'm going to bring that binding around. This is kind of what we talked about at the beginning of class today. I'm going to machine sew this binding down, and so I want the binding to go 1/8 of an inch past my stitching. So I love this part where we are heat setting the binding down in place. If you wanted to hand sew this binding down, then the edge of the binding would lay right on top of the stitching. But I am going to machine sew it down, so I am making sure it's going 1/8 of an inch past. And so do you see how that just holds that in place? And I'm going to finish this out and do the rest of the top of our pocket. The other nice thing about using this particular glue stick for this part, because it is starch based, it does not stick to your iron. It's not going to gum your iron up. That's a question that comes up a lot, and because sometimes it just will get on your iron or definitely gets on your fingers a little bit. So we're going to heat set this in place. And I just love that. So see how nice and easy this is going to be to manage. If you were going to hand sew this down, this is just right in place. You don't have to do clips or adjust. This is exactly where you want to be for you to hand sew this down. And now we're ready to machine sew this binding down. So I'm going to take a minute to change the foot and change the thread on my sewing machine, and we'll be right back.